Hurricane Harvey is rolling in like a freight train, and everyone who has any sense is either already gone or getting ready to leave. But one woman, Crystal McDowell, she decided to stay put. Little did she know that decision was going to be her last. Hey there, Dark Secrets family! Before we dive into today's story, if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We release new true crime content every day, and trust me, you don't want to miss what we have coming up. Also, if you're joining us today, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Now let's get into this story, because what I'm about to tell you is absolutely incredible. Folks, picture this minute. It's August 25th, 2017, and the sky over Texas is looking absolutely ominous. We're talking about that kind of darkness that makes, something terrible is about to happen. Now see, this isn't just your typical missing person case, no. This is about how Mother Nature's fury got mixed up with some real human evil, and how those floodwaters were going to wash away evidence and make this investigation 10 times harder than it needed to be. By the time Harvey was done wreaking havoc, investigators realized they weren't just racing against time, they were going up against a killer who thought the perfect storm would give him the perfect cover. Let me tell you about Crystal McDowell, because she was really something special. This woman was the type that when she walked in a room, everyone felt it. She had that energy. You know what I mean? Friends described her as having this infectious spirit. She knew what she wanted out of life and wasn't afraid to go get it. Crystal had been living that jet-set life as a flight attendant, traveling all over the world with what her people called her gypsy soul. But by 2017, she had switched it up, trading those airplane wings for real estate. At 43, she was building herself a new career and raising two beautiful kids, 8-year-old Madden and 5-year-old Maui. Now, here's where it gets complicated, and I have to keep it real with you. Crystal had just gotten divorced from her husband, Steve McDowell, in June 2017 after 10 years of marriage. But here's the thing, they were still living in the same house. Crystal was in the master bedroom downstairs, and Steve had moved his stuff upstairs. They said it was temporary, just until Crystal's townhouse renovation was finished. Most folks thought they were being all mature about it, keeping it peaceful for the kids and all that. But see, sometimes what looks peaceful on the surface has some real turbulent waters underneath, and that's exactly what was happening here. Crystal had started dating somebody new, Paul Hargrave, who owned a jewelry store in the area. Their relationship was still fresh, only been going on for a few weeks. But folks, Crystal seemed happy, like genuinely happy. Matter of fact, just days before she disappeared, she posted on social media talking about how she had never been happier in her entire life. Now, the timing of all this couldn't have been worse. Hurricane Harvey was coming for the Texas Gulf Coast like it had a personal vendetta. Whether people were on TV talking about catastrophic flooding and unprecedented damage, everyone who could get out was gone. Grocery stores were cleaned out, gas stations were dry, and the highways were packed with people trying to escape what everyone knew was going to be a disaster. But Crystal? She stayed. She had responsibilities, people depending on her. She was a newly licensed real estate agent with clients to think about. She was a mother with kids to protect. This storm was supposed to last for days, and she wanted to make sure her family was safe and prepared. That Friday morning started off normal. Crystal was texting with Paul, her new boyfriend. They were doing that good morning thing, making plans for after the storm passed. Everything seemed regular, but then something changed. Paul kept texting Crystal, but she just stopped responding. At first, he figured she was just busy getting ready for Harvey. Everyone was running around trying to secure their houses and stock up on supplies. But see, Crystal not responding? That wasn't like her at all. This woman stayed in contact with the people she cared about. Her uncle Jeff, who had raised her after her parents died when she was just 11 years old, got messages from Crystal every single morning. She would check in throughout the day, sharing updates about her work, her kids, her life. Jeff always said Crystal was one of the most responsible people he ever knew. She never ever lost contact with family. As Friday turned into Saturday, people started getting worried. Harvey had arrived and it was doing exactly what the weather folks said it would. It was tearing up southeast Texas, something fierce. Baytown, where Crystal lived, was getting hit hard. Streets were flooded, power lines were down, and trying to communicate with anybody was becoming really difficult. But even with all that chaos from the hurricane, Crystal being completely silent was setting off alarm bells. Steve McDowell, Crystal's ex-husband, told family members that Crystal was supposed to come to the house Friday morning. He said she sent him a text at 7:01 that morning saying she was on her way and asking if he had water. The message made it sound like she might stay there with him and the kids since the storm was looking so bad. But according to Steve, Crystal never showed up. Uncle Jeff was getting more worried by the hour. When Saturday stretched into Sunday with no word from Crystal, he started reaching out to everyone, relatives, friends, anybody who might know something. And that's when he heard something that made his stomach drop. Multiple people were telling him the same thing. They just knew something wasn't right. Crystal would never disappear without explanation, especially not when her babies needed her. From an investigation standpoint, folks, this was a nightmare. Hurricane Harvey was destroying everything. Sheriff's deputies were dealing with their own flooded homes while trying to coordinate rescue operations. Some investigators had lost everything they owned to the storm, but they were still showing up to work every day, determined to find Crystal. District Attorney Cheryl Leak later talked about the challenges they were facing. The flooding was so bad that normal police work became almost impossible. Crime scene labs were underwater, evidence collection was messed up. Getting around was limited, but even with all these crazy obstacles, law enforcement wasn't giving up. They understood something Crystal's family already knew. Know-theirs don't just disappear, especially not during natural disasters when their kids need them most. As those floodwaters started going down, investigators began putting together a timeline of Crystal's last few days. What they found painted a picture of a woman who was genuinely excited about her future. She had been making plans with Paul to travel to Europe. She had invited him to join her family on an upcoming cruise. But here's where it gets interesting. Her ex-husband Steve was also supposed to be on that cruise. This little detail was going to prove to be way more important than anybody realized at first. Paul had expressed some concern about how awkward it would be joining a family vacation that included Crystal's ex-husband. He had asked Crystal if maybe Steve could skip the trip. According to Paul, Crystal approached Steve about not going on the cruise, and Steve's reaction was intense. He was visibly upset about being excluded from what he apparently saw as a chance to get back together with Crystal. The investigation got even more complicated because Crystal knew everyone. As a former flight attendant and current real estate agent, she had people all across Texas and beyond. She was described as extremely social, somebody who kept friendships from every part of her life. This meant investigators had dozens of potential witnesses to interview, relationships to explore, and alibis to check out. 3 men quickly emerged as persons of interest in Crystal's disappearance. There was Steve McDowell, the ex-husband, who was still sharing a home with Crystal and seemed to be holding on to hopes of getting back together. There was Paul Hargrave, the new boyfriend, who had been one of the last people to have contact with Crystal. And somewhat surprisingly, there was Uncle Jeff himself, whose emotional involvement in the case and tendency to interfere with the investigation had started raising questions among law enforcement. Each of these men had a different story about Crystal's final hours. Each one claimed they wanted nothing more than to see her return safely, but investigators were about to discover that the truth was way more complicated than any of them were willing to admit. The breakthrough in this case came from an unexpected place. While law enforcement was struggling with flooded roads and damaged communication systems, Crystal's family and friends had organized their own search efforts. They knew the areas Crystal went to, understood her habits and routines in ways that even the most dedicated investigators couldn't match. And it was this personal knowledge that led to the discovery everyone had been hoping and praying for. Crystal's black Mercedes was found sitting in the parking lot of a Motel 6. The doors were unlocked, and the keys were just sitting there on the center console, bold as day. Sheriff Hawthorne arrived at the scene and immediately knew something was off. In all his years in law enforcement, he had never seen an abandoned vehicle staged, so obviously everything about the scene was screaming setup. The car's placement seemed almost like somebody was putting on a show. It was positioned where anybody could see it, like someone wanted it to be found. But whoever left it there hadn't counted on the massive flooding Harvey was going to bring. The rising waters had trapped that Mercedes in the parking lot, making it impossible for anyone to drive it away. What had probably been planned as a temporary hiding spot had become a permanent crime scene. Processing the vehicle presented some unique challenges. The flood damage had messed up potential evidence, and the crime lab facilities in Houston were dealing with their own hurricane problems. Many of the technicians and analysts had lost their homes to the storm, but they kept working around the clock to help solve this case. The dedication was remarkable, but the practical limitations were undeniable. Sheriff's deputies started going to nearby businesses, hoping to find security cameras that might have caught whoever abandoned Crystal's car. The investigation was slow, painstaking work made even harder by the storm's aftermath. Many businesses had flood damage, and their surveillance systems were offline, but investigators kept at it, checking every possible angle. Their persistence paid off when they found footage from a Shell gas station next to the motel. The grainy video showed a figure getting out of what appeared to be Crystal's Mercedes and walking to a nearby trash can. The person seemed to be throwing something away, pushing it deep into the container with deliberate force. Even more telling was the way this individual kept looking toward the motel, like they were checking to make sure the car was still where it had been left. The footage wasn't perfect, but experienced investigators could make out enough details to identify the person as Steve McDowell. This was the first concrete evidence linking Crystal's ex-husband to her disappearance, and it completely changed the direction of the investigation. Additional surveillance footage from the motel's own cameras showed someone parking Crystal's car and walking away. Again, the figure looked a lot like Steve McDowell. For investigators who had been working with limited physical evidence, these videos represented a major breakthrough. They finally had something solid to work with. Now let me tell you about Steve McDowell's behavior during this time, because it was raising red flags all over the place. While Crystal's family and friends were out searching day and night, organizing volunteer efforts and putting up flyers, Steve seemed oddly detached from the whole situation. He wasn't participating in the searches. He wasn't helping coordinate efforts. For somebody whose ex-wife and mother of his children had vanished, his reaction was strange. Even more suspicious was how Steve was talking to investigators. His story kept changing in small but significant ways. First, he said Crystal was supposed to arrive at the house Friday morning but never showed up. Then he started adding details about their text conversation that hadn't been mentioned before. When investigators asked to see these text messages, Steve claimed his phone had been damaged in the flood. But here's what really got investigators' attention. Steve's alibi for Friday morning was shaky. He claimed he was at the house waiting for Crystal, but neighbors couldn't confirm seeing his truck there during the time Crystal was supposed to arrive. One neighbor specifically remembered the street being unusually quiet that morning, with most people having already evacuated or staying indoors preparing for the storm. As investigators dug deeper into Steve's background, they discovered some troubling information. Despite what everyone believed about their amicable divorce, there had been significant tension between Steve and Crystal in recent months. Financial disputes, disagreements about the children, and Steve's apparent inability to accept that the marriage was truly over. Friends of Crystal began coming forward with stories about Steve's behavior that painted a different picture than what he was presenting to investigators. Crystal had confided in several people that Steve was having trouble accepting their divorce. She had mentioned that he still seemed to think they would get back together, despite her clear statements that she had moved on. The cruise situation was particularly telling when Crystal had approached Steve about not joining the family vacation so her new boyfriend Paul could come instead. Steve's reaction had been explosive. According to witnesses, he had become visibly angry and had made several concerning statements about Crystal replacing him and taking away his family. But investigators needed more than suspicious behavior and questionable alibis. They needed physical evidence, and that's when they made a discovery that would change everything. During their search of the area around the Motel 6, investigators found what they believed to be Crystal's remains. The location was significant. It was an area that Steve McDowell was known to be familiar with. The discovery was devastating for Crystal's family, but it also provided investigators with the evidence they needed to move forward with charges. So the condition of the remains and the location where they were found painted a grim picture. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This was planned. Someone had specifically chosen this location because they knew it well and they had believed the hurricane would provide cover for their actions. Forensic analysis would later confirm that these were indeed Crystal's remains. The cause of death was determined to be homicide, though the specific details were devastating for her family to hear. What was clear was that Crystal had been killed, and her body had been disposed of in a location where her killer believed it would never be found. The arrest of Steve McDowell came after weeks of investigation and evidence gathering. When law enforcement took him into custody, he maintained his innocence, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The surveillance footage showing him disposing of evidence and abandoning Crystal's car was just the beginning. Investigators had also discovered that Steve had lied about his whereabouts on the morning Crystal disappeared. Cell phone records showed his phone had been in areas he claimed he never visited. His truck had been captured on additional surveillance cameras in locations that contradicted his stated timeline. Perhaps most damning was the discovery of Crystal's personal belongings in areas where Steve had been seen disposing of items. Blood evidence in Steve's truck and on clothing found in his possession provided the final pieces of the puzzle investigators needed. The trial of Steve McDowell would become one of the most closely watched cases in the region. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who couldn't accept that his marriage was over, who became increasingly desperate as Crystal moved on with her life, and who saw Hurricane Harvey as an opportunity to eliminate the source of his perceived problems. The defense attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the hurricane had compromised the investigation, and that there were other possible suspects who hadn't been thoroughly investigated. They pointed to Paul Hargrave, the new boyfriend, and even suggested that Uncle Jeff's behavior during the investigation was suspicious. But the evidence was overwhelming. The surveillance footage, the cell phone records, the physical evidence, and the testimonies from multiple witnesses all pointed to the same conclusion. Steve McDowell had killed Crystal McDowell and used Hurricane Harvey as cover for his crime. The most heartbreaking testimony came from Crystal's family and friends, who described a vibrant, loving woman who had been excited about her future. They talked about her devotion to her children, her enthusiasm for her new career, and her genuine happiness with Paul. The picture they painted was of someone who had everything to live for, someone whose life was tragically cut short by a man who couldn't accept that she had moved on. Uncle Jeff's testimony was particularly powerful. He talked about raising Crystal after her parents died, about watching her grow into a strong, independent woman, and about the daily phone calls and text messages that had been such a constant part of their relationship. When those messages stopped coming, he knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The prosecution also presented evidence about the domestic violence that had been present in Steve and Crystal's marriage, details that hadn't been widely known even to close family members. Crystal had hidden much of the abuse, trying to protect her children and maintain stability in their lives. But the evidence showed a pattern of controlling behavior, emotional manipulation, and escalating violence that had culminated in murder. When the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all charges, Crystal's family finally felt like they could begin to heal. Steve McDowell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring Crystal back or undo the trauma her children had experienced. The impact on Crystal's children, Madden and Maui, was devastating. Not only had they lost their mother, but they had to come to terms with the fact that their father was responsible for her death. Uncle Jeff, who had already raised Crystal after losing his own siblings, now found himself in the position of raising her children as well. The case highlighted several important issues about domestic violence, the challenges of investigating crimes during natural disasters, and the importance of taking missing person cases seriously from the very beginning. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied this case to better understand how to handle similar situations in the future. For the community of Baytown, Crystal's murder was a stark reminder that evil can exist anywhere, even in seemingly normal families. The case shattered many people's assumptions about what domestic violence looks like and how quickly a situation can turn deadly. Hurricane Harvey had been one of the most destructive natural disasters in American history, causing billions of dollars in damage and displacing hundreds of thousands of people. But for Crystal McDowell's family, the storm would always be remembered as the backdrop for an even more devastating personal tragedy. In the years since Crystal's murder, her family has worked to keep her memory alive and to raise awareness about domestic violence. They've established scholarships in her name and have spoken publicly about the warning signs of abuse that they wish they had recognized sooner. The case also led to improvements in how law enforcement agencies handle missing person cases during natural disasters. New protocols were established to ensure that investigations could continue even when departments are dealing with their own emergency situations. Crystal's story serves as a reminder that behind every true crime case is a real person with dreams, hopes, and people who love them. Crystal McDowell wasn't just a victim, she was a mother, a daughter figure to her uncle, a friend to many, and a woman who was building a new life for herself when that opportunity was stolen from her. The investigation into Crystal's disappearance and murder showcased both the challenges and the dedication of law enforcement professionals who refused to give up despite overwhelming obstacles. Their persistence in the face of a natural disaster ensured that Crystal's killer was brought to justice. Today, Crystal's children are growing up surrounded by the love of their extended family and the community that rallied around them during their darkest hours. While they will always carry the trauma of losing their mother in such a horrific way, they are also surrounded by stories of her love, her strength, and her dreams for their future. The case of Crystal McDowell remains one of the most compelling examples of how human evil can attempt to hide behind natural disasters, but also how the dedication of investigators and the love of family can ensure that justice prevails. Her story continues to resonate with people across the country who see in Crystal a reflection of their own loved ones, someone who deserved so much better than the fate that befell her. Steve McDowell's conviction brought closure to Crystal's family, but it also served as a warning to others who might think they can use tragedy and chaos to cover their crimes. The message was clear: no matter what obstacles exist, law enforcement will not give up on victims or their families. In remembering Crystal McDowell, we honor not just her life, but also the lives of all domestic violence victims whose stories might not make national headlines, but whose losses are equally devastating to their families and communities. Her case reminds us that domestic violence can escalate quickly and fatally, and that the warning signs should never be ignored. Folks, that's the tragic story of Crystal McDowell, a woman whose life was cut short by someone who was supposed to protect her. If you or someone you know is dealing with domestic violence, please reach out for help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share this video. Crystal's story deserves to be told, and awareness can save lives. Make sure you're subscribed to Dark Secrets Released for more true crime content, and drop a comment letting us know your thoughts on this case. Remember, behind every story we tell is a real person whose life mattered. Crystal McDowell was more than a victim. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend, and a woman with dreams. Let's honor her memory by never forgetting her story. Until next time, stay safe out there and keep seeking the truth.